Okay, that is the end of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's testimony at the public inquiry into foreign interference. It started just after 3:30 Eastern Time this afternoon. They took a 20-minute break and it's ending now just 8 minutes before 7 o'clock. I'm David Cochran. Welcome back to an extended edition of Power and Politics, where we have been taking the Prime Minister's testimony live and interpreting it when we can during the breaks. And here now to help us, and me in particular, understand what we heard from the Prime Minister, two former CSIS directors, Ward Elcock and Richard Fadden. I want to thank you both and thank your families for sitting with us through all these hours this afternoon. Richard Fadden, I want to start with you. Big picture in terms of what we've learned from the Prime Minister today, his ministers, the staff, PMO staff yesterday. Are there any surprises at this point in the inquiry on the issue of foreign interference and how the Prime Minister's office responded to it, his government?
Broadly speaking, I don't think there's anything earth-shattering. I mean, there were some interesting points here and there. You'll perhaps be surprised to hear me say that the thing that surprised me the most was the ongoing, increasingly better explanations of how the system works. This is not an easy thing. You know, people just don't push a button, the Prime Minister reads the material and makes an executive decision. But even the explanation that the Prime Minister made about who does what to whom, the complexity of dealing with these issues, I think was very useful. The other thing I thought was useful is pointing out again and again that intelligence is unproven information. It's much like unproven media reporting. And I think the responsibility for reconciling what we've heard from one or other of the various witnesses rests with the Commission. Mm-hmm. But I think they're going to have a tough time. They're talking about people's memories about things that happened a long time ago. And I think it's been made very clear that just because something is on a piece of paper, either a briefing note or a record of meeting doesn't necessarily capture absolutely everything or anything. So that, I think, provides context a little bit.
Okay, so Ward, I want to ask you about that because you've both run CSIS. You've both been the intelligence advisors in some form or another to prime ministers. So Ward Elcock, when the Prime Minister says just because something is written in a briefing note, prepared for the briefer to brief the Prime Minister, it doesn't mean it was necessarily communicated to them, and that seems to be one of the issues at play here and why David Vigneault has been the current head of CSIS is being called back on Friday. Is that how it actually works?
Well, there's some narrow. You can argue that there's some narrow issues that David may still have to deal with. Having said that, I think the Prime Minister made it fairly clear, and his staff have made it fairly clear as well. The way the Prime Minister is normally briefed is orally. The fact that there's a piece of paper is, if you will, aspirational. These are the things you want to cover, but when you actually get into the meeting with whoever you're briefing, whether it's Prime Minister or another minister or whatever, and I've had a number over the years, what you actually get to talk about will depend on how tired the minister is, how late they got to sleep last night.
Human dynamics, meeting dynamics.
Human dynamics. And and the way in which they normally like to I think the last time probably ministers read documents fully through was probably around 1880. Right. Since then, things have gotten much more complicated, and the pressure on prime ministers and ministers is enormous in terms of the amount of time demanded of them. And so most of them now, it's an oral brief. At best.
Okay, so just help me understand that. So when they say, just because this was written down, it doesn't mean we heard it, saw it, or read it, that is credible. And when they say there is information in different reports that is unverifiable, that may not have made their way to them, is that also credible? Should we take that?
That's entirely credible, frankly. And the Prime Minister said as much when he said that his discussions with the director of CSIS or others were really often conversations. Right. I mean, these are people he's dealt with many times over the years. And so you build up a relationship and you have a conversation. You hope you get all of the information through that you need to get through, but the reality is you got a limited amount of time and a lot of stuff to cover. And so you try and hit the high points of what you have to have exchanged.
Just to illustrate, I've briefed some of my political masters in elevators and in cars rushing to the airport.
So have I.
So it's important, I think, to realize that prime ministers do not always have the time to sit down, focus on you and in what's in front of you, and make decisions. It's just they are too busy, the issues are too complicated, and they also over time accumulate knowledge themselves. And one thing that I think we've both learned is they don't like having things repeated too many times.
Yes.
Right.
So you've got to pick the 1 or 2 or 3 items that are really important and that they will retain.
Okay, so based on that, based on your experience in, I guess, comparable dynamics, based on what we've seen in the intelligence summaries and the testimony to this point, Richard Fadden, to start with you, have you seen any clear examples? Let's look at Don Valley North. Let's look at Han Dong and his conversations with the Michaels. Let's look at these other allegations of money flowing in to somehow circulate inside elections. Have you seen any clear examples of a failure to act by this government based on the information we've seen and they appear to have had in those moments?
From what we've seen and heard, I would say basically no. They have been given information that suggests there's a potential issue. They've been given information that they, by and large, have only not been able to confirm. Like they've got one indication, one flow of information. So you don't sort of end somebody's career, to take up the point Ms. Telfer made yesterday. You don't, send something to the RCMP, for criminal prosecution if you're not fairly certain. So I think everything that we've heard so far suggests that yes, there was an issue, yes, there were problems and challenges, but they haven't really risen to the point where, to use an old expression, executive action can be taken. And there may be more because we haven't seen the classified versions of all of this. But on the basis of what we've heard and I've seen, significant failure to act, I don't think so. What
about you, Ward Elcock? How do you view it?
I'd agree with that. I guess the other thing I would say is that there's an assumption here that there's an assumption that there needed to be action on a variety of things, but the reality is, as Dick said, most of what we've seen so far is relatively. There's information, but not anything that's actually sufficiently confirmed that you've actually got something actionable. It's still important that that be communicated to the government, because if you never communicated to the government the information that you had, you only communicate when you actually have chapter and verse and can actually give it to the RCMP and have somebody prosecuted. Then it's so hard to get to the government to actually bring the information to them, to explain it to them and get them to understand it, that you can't make any progress. And the other reality is, too, that in some cases we've clearly seen that for CSIS, they had some information, but the actual giving of it to the government enabled them to get information from the government that actually gave some context to the information that CSIS had. Like the case where the Prime Minister said, well, I didn't actually have that meeting, so the fact that your source told you that I had that meeting, I didn't have it.
So help me on that, because that's something his staff was very strategically, I think, bringing up yesterday and that he zeroed in on today. It seems to me like that is a clear attempt in the minds of the justice to impeach the credibility of whatever is in that document, saying this big central fact is wrong, so you had to look at everything else through that lens. How would you react to that if in a meeting with the Prime Minister they flat out discredited intelligence that your agents had collected?
Well, go back for a second. The reality is that as director of CSIS, you have to know that the intelligence you have is intelligence. It's not evidence.
Right.
And so it's not absolutely right. There is a possibility that you will discover that there are gaps in that intelligence or that there are failures in that intelligence, and that can happen any time. The fact that it happens with the Prime Minister or another minister is not actually a surprise. It does happen. And I would expect that does happen occasionally and not something you get upset about.
Can I just add to that? I have no quarrel at all with anybody who's pushing up material to the Prime Minister, sort of saying to CSIS or anybody else, I'm not sure I understand this. Does the title match the body? Is there enough context? So I think if Ms. Telfer was trying to suggest that this was an extraordinary thing to do, I don't agree with her. I mean, it's part of her job, just like it's the part of the job of the NSA and the CSIS director to make sure that they question all the way up. The problem arises if this becomes a constant problem and you're constantly finding difficulties. But challenging the material to make sure that the Prime Minister gets what he needs is not an issue.
So on that, where we talked about this on Friday, about the report that David Vigneault ordered pulled back on the level of Chinese government interference in Don Valley North. So, Richard, just to get your thoughts on that, there's been some question about that this is an unusual thing to pull this information back. Is it appropriate that it happened after a conversation with the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister? Is that an abnormal, improper thing, or is this a typical thing that might happen in the sharing of information?
Things don't get pulled back very often. And although the time that I was either CSIS director or NSA, I can only think of one instance, and it was a really particular issue. To have something taken back and modified, upgraded, brought up to date, that's not so rare.
Okay.
So I think that's also true, for example, in media reporting. It's true in some academic stuff. We seem to be developing a model that, once something is done by CSIS or CSE or whomever else,
it's definitive.
It's picture perfect forever. And that's simply not a reflection of the reality that everybody has to deal with.
So Ward, we seem to be in a situation where we're having a very public inquiry with fragmented information, heavily redacted, a lot of it driven by the conclusions in imperfect information gathered by intelligence officials that may or may not have been reliable enough to act upon. It is a difficult proposition for the public to parse all of this and draw firm conclusions, it seems to me. I'm struggling with a lot of this.
Yes, although, and I think some of your compatriots in some of the reporting I'd seen earlier made the point, which is not an unimportant one. If people are beginning to understand that intelligence is not evidence, really understand that intelligence is not evidence, that it is subject to evolution and it can change and you can confirm this bit and maybe you can't confirm. If people begin to understand the complications of intelligence better than they have up until now, then that may actually be a good thing as a result. But the result, the hard part for the Commission is to try and make progress through all of this.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree with that entirely, but I also think there's intelligence and intelligence. I mean, if you have intelligence that says that a bomb is going to explode in Lower Mandible, Manitoba, you act on it, unless it's totally fatuous. So it depends to some considerable degree. So I just add that very small caveat to what
well, and there's signals intelligence, and there's human intelligence, and there's all of these things. But here's where I want to kind of bring your world and my world together, right? As people, I work in media and journalism, you work in intelligence and security over the course of your careers. And this inquiry is because of a collision of those two worlds in a lot of ways. And what we are seeing is some big headlines from a year ago and a little over a year ago. It was talked about today, the global reporting that Handong urged the Chinese consulate to hold on to the Michaels. And the Prime Minister spoke about this earlier, about the difficulty in pushing back against what they believe to be inaccurate information because of the constraints on protecting national security. That, in essence, one side of the argument is breaking the law by leaking information. The other side is bound by the law by upholding national security laws. How do we reconcile the introduction of this issue, Richard Fadden, to the public with the earlier reporting, with what we're seeing in summary intelligence documents and sworn testimony under oath that is contradicting so much of what was put out there?
Well, surely that's one of the jobs the Commission is going to have to do. I'm not sure that you and I can do it with Ward over the course of the next 15 or 25 minutes, but I think it's probably possible if you take your time, you write carefully, you explain both worlds, and you explain why some things are true, some things aren't true. You explain how some bits of understanding have shifted over time, because I think that's important too. Knowledge and information grows over time. And I think we're seeing some evidence of this over the course of the last little while because people have acquired additional data, they've acquired additional information. But I think in the end, if the Commission cannot do this, if they can't answer your question by taking a bit of time and reflection, then it will have been a failure. But I think you're pointing to a very, very fundamental challenge in our system, which is that everybody that we've talked about today on the government side is bound by very strict rules, but also not just rules, but to Ward's earlier point, they're bound by understandings that if we reveal information, we lose the capacity to acquire intelligence over time. Right. And that's at considerable cost.
Yeah, and if they're lying in these environments, Ward Elcock, they face very severe penalties, jail time. I mean, how do we reconcile the two different versions on what happened in some of these key moments that punctuate the story?
Well, in some respects, you may not be able to, because unless and until the person who leaked the information, the information that now looks as if it was mostly inaccurate, until that person is identified and presumably prosecuted at some point, it's pretty hard to come to. And the commission will likely, I think, in the end, make it clear that that information was inaccurate, as did David Johnson say that it was inaccurate. How much the public will believe is open to question, because a lot of people will never get beyond the information they saw,
right,
and so on. So
right.
There's a challenge, but ultimately, if there is a prosecution, that may change things for people.
So Richard Fadden, we might get that on very specific elements of very specific stories, but on the broad level that China and other state actors have been trying to interfere in Canadian elections, that macro thesis applies and has been reinforced here. So I wonder, just based on what we've seen, though, what conclusions can we draw about the scope, the level, and the effectiveness of foreign interference as it comes to the 2019 and 2021 elections?
Well, I conclude that there was some activity, there was some foreign interference. I conclude, in agreement with virtually everybody, that it had no effect overall on the election results. But I'm not able to conclude that in particular constituencies they did not have an impact. Yeah. And I don't think we're ever going to know the extent of the impact. But picking up the theme I think that Mr. O'Toole raised in front of the Commission last week, it doesn't matter if it's successful or not. It doesn't matter if the impact is small. We need to do something to make sure that these issues are dealt with. And I'm not sure they can all be dealt with by the state. Political parties may have a role here to tighten things up a little bit. Yeah, and Aaron O'Toole made the point that individual ridings can't be rounding errors in democracy, which is a very important point to underscore. Ward Elcock, same question to you. We've got about a minute left before I got to hand over the network.
I guess I would say the only, I'm sure Mr. O'Toole believes what he said. Whether, in fact, it's an accurate assessment of what happened, I can't honestly say. I think there's some assumptions that he's making that are probably open to question in terms of what actually affected this riding over that riding. It's not clear, frankly, whether it was foreign interference or whether it was somewhere else. I thought the minister, the government house leader, was actually fairly clear on that point this morning. Even if somebody goes into the box having decided that they believe some piece of misinformation from wherever it came, whether it was domestic or foreign or somewhere else, that Canadian is casting their ballot. And that ballot is a valid ballot as long as they're not being coerced into doing something or bribed to do something or whatever.
Okay, gentlemen, we've got to leave it. There's a lot more we can talk about, but I do have to give back the channel to the proper host. I want to thank former CSIS directors Ward Elcock, Richard Fadden. Thank you so much. And one programming note before we go tonight: France's new Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, has landed in Ottawa. I'll be sitting down with him tomorrow for an exclusive English language interview.